We organiseren deze avond niet alleen, maar samen met het kunstencentrum uit Brussel, Recyclaar VZ2. Zij organiseren al jaren onder de noemer Greetings from architectuurlezingen in het Brusselse en zijn vandaag naar Brugge gekomen voor deze lezing Greetings from Liquid City. Maar vooraleer we van start gaan, geef ik graag nog even het woord aan Stéphane Damsin. Hij is de coördinator van het architectuurprogramma bij Recyclaar. Bedankt.
Good evening. Thanks for being here with us tonight with Amale, Andraos and Dan Wood from New York. We're very happy to be here. As Shani said, we organized this event tonight together with TRIENNALE, Brugge and Recyclaar. I try to explain it easily, the whole story, who's WORKac, who's Anfarm, who's Recyclaar, who's whatever, TRIENNALE. But I think it's not easy, so I'm going to do it a bit as a more complex story. So Recyclaar is an art center in Brussels. It's not only art center, we also have a restaurant, a workshop for steel and wood, and we used to have activities for the last 20 years in a almost former train station in the center of Brussels. It's called Brussels Chapelle, and there we were running a lot of activities, parties, dog wash, lectures, DJing, food, whatever things. We enjoyed it a lot, but then we got evicted a few months ago. Then we started to go nomadic and trying to have our activities a bit everywhere in Brussels. But we also made a replica, a wooden replica of our former gallery where we were running exhibitions. And this replica is now hosted in the EXO Steel World Trade Center in Brussels, and this World Trade Center is now also the decor. Well, much more than decor. It's becoming the World Transformation Center for another event around architecture, which is the Rotterdam Biennale for architecture, which has now also a program in Brussels. This is the program in Brussels of the Rotterdam Biennale, so you are here. So somehow it's quite funny because today we are speaking about a lot of biennales, triennales. You will see we'll go to Chicago in a few minutes. So our replica is now a host of IABR. But inside this replica, this is the place where it's a former bank lobby. Now everything is empty in these levels of the building. Just in front you have a lot of migrants sleeping outside in tents, but all this area is empty. Anyway, in the replica itself, we are hosting an exhibition together with TRIENNALE Brugge, a project of Wesley Morris. He's an Antwerp artist, and he's also having installation here in the city center. So this is so in the mark of the Biennale we have this project of TRIENNALE. This is the exhibition running in Brussels by Wesley. He's giving a talk next week. This is the pavilion by Wesley here in Brugge. Yeah, and now we are here in this pavilion. It's a work by Spanish architect Selgascano. Of course, you see it better than on the image. But if I show the image, it's just because I wanted to make the parallel with this image, because now we enter a bit in the content of the talk. The topic of the Triennale is Liquid City. It's also the name of a project by WORKac. I'm going to present them a bit better afterwards. And WORKac, for the Chicago Biennale 3 years ago, started working again with and on the content and some documents still there, because a lot of the archive disappeared in a fire in the late 70s. But on the archive of this kind of underground avant-garde collective called Anfarm. Anfarm was created in San Francisco, and they were kind of pioneering these inflatables systems. So I think it's nice to have this talk here today. Yeah. First inflatables, it was a bit more hippie, everyone was naked. Now I feel like we have too much clothes. Yeah, they look more sexy, no? This is one of their very famous artwork in the desert with the Cadillac Ranch. Yes, then in the mark of the Chicago Biennale, and I think it's nice to make this link between Biennale and Triennale because I see it much more like, and I think this project by WORKac is really relevant. It's, of course, we always want to show new things and new statements, but if you see the position of Anne Form at that time, and then the idea of WORKac to take this archive again and see what we can do with these material and statements 40 years later, it's still so relevant. So somehow I feel it's really risky and interesting to go in the past to show new ideas. Yes, here we go. Amale and Dan, they used to live in Europe for a couple of years, 10 years I think, before going to New York in 2002 and starting the office WORKac in 2003. Yes, here I quickly show, but just the images. They're gonna explain it, of course. They created for this floating city project based on archive of WORKac, continuing the project. So a kind of Canary ski story and project. And yes, here we go. Triennale. Quickly to present both of them. So Amale is now Dean of Columbia Architecture School. She's the first woman to be Dean of that prestigious institution. And she has been teaching also in many other universities. Dan is also, sorry for that. Is teaching in a lot of universities, Princeton, Berkeley, Yale, and so on. And together they run the office and this new book about their work. Yeah, I'm very happy to have you here. I think it's really relevant for the Triennale, for all of us. Speech is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, but we're going to switch anyway.
Yeah.
I'm just going to stand here for the first.
Thank you.
Looking good.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. I have to say this is probably one of the best lecture settings we've ever been. It was wonderful yesterday to see the Triennale and the idea of these beautiful installations that I think really ask the question, if climate change is today probably the most important sort of life, changing sort of force that we're kind of engaged in, then what is the impact on architecture? Literally, not just building more sustainable cities, not just all these things that we need to, we know we have to do, but literally fundamentally, how is it going to transform, and how can we use our imagination and use architecture to think about new ways of living in cities? And that's been certainly one of the questions for us over the last 15 years of our practice, and we've often turned to sort of previous moments in time where kind of radical practices were engaging these larger environmental questions to understand, how did they engage and how can we sort of tie again to that history. So today we're going to talk about liquid city in a kind of expanded way, which is, how do we bring water into architecture in all its forms, not just literally water, but plants and rain, and the thing that architecture has always tried to avoid is water, right? The big joke of Le Corbusier's buildings is, oh, they leak. But now we have to deal with water almost as a material, and so a lot of our practice has been actually as a result of this invitation, thinking about water and bringing water to buildings, and by extension extension, using that as a way to reinvent, nature. Now we have to construct nature again and sort of make room for other species. And so this talk will revolve around these questions, around the set of projects, including the floating city that Stefan mentioned, but also other projects to kind of show a little bit the way we've been thinking about this issue across scale. And through the lens of writing, actually, because we do believe that although we're practicing architects, the place for the imagination, for projective ideas is really through writing, through theoretical projects, and so we really tie research and practice together, and always write. So this was one of our first books, Above the Pavement, the Farm, which was written as a way to think about urban farming in cities and how we bring back, or rather we bring kind of that level of thinking about cities as a closed system that can kind of feed itself. The book wasn't selling very well, so Dan built an overscaled, this was his response to the question of scale in architecture, and tried to sell it at the farmer's market, but it didn't quite work. In my own research, I'm very interested in the question of context, which I'll be talking about, and how we think about context again. I mean, look at this city, it's all about context, and yet it's completely different from, when it was today in what it means as context. And so I've done a lot of research on the question of the Arab city, not so much because I'm interested in the Arab city, but because I'm interested in these questions of context and how we intervene in a global world and global society today. And one of our first books is 49 Cities, actually, which we wrote in 2007 to think about visionary cities and really engage with that history of visionary cities. And a lot of these cities were, many of them were liquid. Of course, you have the Japanese, Kikutake and Tange, and who Tokyo being what it was, always imagined, well, how can we live on the water? But other cities, although not being literally on the water, were thinking about being sort of self-contained and having systems, and whether water, food, etc., that were all kind of part of the city. In a way that maybe, so this is the ocean city, of course, Kikutake, beautiful, and I also like to show this slide because I think our work sits a little bit between these two pages of the book. On the one hand, on the left, we measured these cities, we measured their density, their open space, they're kind of very much like a kind of calorie listing of ingredients. But on the other hand, we still believe that architecture as form, as shape, still has agency. And so to go from performance to form and try to always keep the two together is something that we're very conscious of. So this is the book in which we tell a lot of these stories, and we like to think about this, architecture as a way to look at the world, but also we like to bring the world and questions of climate change to architecture today as a way to reinvent it in a kind of feedback loop. And so the first, first chapter of the book, but in a way more, I think some of the set of ideas that we like to think about in the work, including the questions of environmental concerns, is how do we design for other species? This was one of our first projects. It was a dog house and so we were invited to think about a dog house, but instead of just thinking about a normal dog house, we said we should think about the urban dog's house, and so the whole house is about creating new virtual experiences for the urban dog to have the experience of its rural cousins. So again, thinking about other species, thinking about how we create new homes for them. This is another project where water was very central. We decided that the Guggenheim approached us, the museum in New York, and to kind of think about reinventing the Guggenheim, and we said we should flood the Guggenheim and use the kind of ramp to create what we call the flow show, a new form of exhibition where you swim down the ramp and you can experience art. And in Frank Lloyd Wright's beautiful void in the middle, we said we could put this filtering plant that would recycle the water. So already we were thinking about ideas of water and preservation and flooding. and questions of representation. This was for the Rotterdam Biennale, a theoretical master plan for Beirut as a critique to the master plan that was done, and in this case also engaging with the kind of shoreline. Beirut, over the years of the war, claimed new land on the water for speculation, for development, and our intervention was to cut it and kind of give back this land to grow trees and cedar trees, to kind of replant the mountain. So all these gestures, at the intersection of land and water are really happening every day in our cities. And we make a lot of models. We like to think about architecture a little bit like this structure. It's not just about space, but it's about color, it's about texture. And with the slightest fabric or envelope or the thinnest envelope, you can create a sense of space and shelter. And we kind of try to thin our interventions at times and use minimum materials. And designing, even a kind of balloon that can be used as a kind of cover for, as architecture, and we have to kind of rethink architecture in the smallest ways. And also think about density. Climate change is also going to sort of force us to densify even further and to reinvent interiors and to reinvent kind of section. And so we bring a lot of that thinking even to the smallest apartments that we do in New York, cutting holes to bring natural light and finding ways to sort of always integrate the outside and the inside, even in the kind of densest spaces. In New York, this is a carved courtyard, which is 2 stories below the kind of street level in New York, but allows for natural light and for plants to grow. So finding these moments is kind of really critical. And so the kind of question of context is a really critical one, as sort of land is constantly transformed for speculation. This is the second chapter in the book, but it thinks about two separate contexts which actually have a lot to do with one another. The first is Ordos. We were invited in China by Ai Weiwei and Herzog & de Meuron as a part of 100 architects to design a new villa in the desert of Ordos, so middle of nowhere. And how do you think about context in that sort of environment? But we realized that this was the condition of the global architect today, kind of being invited everywhere for the service of developers or speculative kind of transformation of land. And so the similar project we were invited to do is a store in California, also in the middle of another desert, where ironically the kind of lifestyle mall was called Dos Lagos, 2 lakes. There were no lakes when we got there. So everything was constructed very artificially, but there used to be orange trees on that site. And so while the lifestyle mall was completely empty and in construction on the one hand, the sort of suburban little house was being deployed on the other to kind of where these residents would be served by kind of the shopping mall. And so the project became a little bit of a reflection on this idea of context. It's a store for the fashion designer Anthropology, and a lot of it was kind of strategically thinking about bringing nature back to, or integrating nature and architecture in a way. The top of the facade has this kind of very graphic pattern of circles where vines grow from the top, and so over time the building is covered with vines. This is kind of a few years later, but also always kind of indicating the artificiality of that. So the graphic circles are a way to kind of show the construction of that nature. And on the second part, at the bottom of the facade, is trying to create this kind of crenellated facade to create sort of an inside and outside, and create moments of shade and moments of rest, so that you sort of articulate that boundary between the interior and the exterior. And so for these little moments of kind of stopping in the shade, and on the inside, we again thought about bringing the outdoor in and carved this big courtyard where they sort of originally grew orange trees because the site had been a site for orange trees, so we were kind of thinking about preservation or memory, but through planting and landscape. And then playing between that sort of artificially constructed nature on one hand, and then on the other, so this is kind of this very big courtyard in the space, thinking about an artificial topography of this hill that's shoppable. So always thinking about kind of the naturally constructed and the sort of artificially imagined at the same time. And even bringing that, you have swans, so we had swans on our wallpaper, but layering those ideas into architecture. And then third, another chapter in the book, also kind of tying to 49 cities, is what we call infrastructure. Obviously, it's infrastructure and food, and thinking about food systems as a way to reinvent cities and to reinvent urbanism. When we first started in New York, we felt that a lot of the urban thinking that I think European practices have is lacks sometimes in the U.S. and we were kind of coming much more from that kind of background. So a lot of these ideas were brought to think about urbanism in the U.S. and thinking about not focusing on buildings per se, but focusing on the space between buildings, streets. What happens when car automation happened? Could we imagine transforming the streets into urban farms or a new kind of form of nature, or even channeling Le Corbusier in terms of his idea of wilderness and buildings in wilderness, and all these ideas we can kind of bring back somehow, thinking about topography and bringing farming to kind of buildings and vertical farming, or different typology of housing, where core of a building would be reinvented not to just serve to circulate people, but also to circulate water, fish farms, temperature, find ways for cores of buildings to do more than just serve the building itself and really serve the neighborhood as a whole, almost like a hub. Or thinking about, imagining how fish farms can become public infrastructure in cities and kind of provide food, but also a place for people to go to. So all of these kind of very, let's say, productive theoretical ideas made it into our installation for MoMA PS1 in 2008, where we actually were invited to build an installation, and we proposed an urban farm, a quarter-acre urban farm made entirely out of cardboard tubes. So there's nothing more stupid than to bring water and paper together, but that's what we did and spent a lot of time kind of waterproofing the cardboard tubes. But what was interesting here was to think about doubling the ground once, so that you would create a sort of sort of program underneath for play, for new experiences, and then have the kind of urban farm at the top, which was all solar powered, used drip irrigation, and 50 types of fruit and vegetables grew in the structure throughout the summer with events. And then underneath, each column organized program in terms of play and activities, and so it was a way to activate, to think about how we're going to reimagine public space in cities and integrate water systems, food systems, and infrastructure together into new kinds of architecture.
And in PS1, one of the other things we did with that project was to hook up a big cistern to all the roofs of the museum buildings, so that we were collecting rainwater throughout the summer and then pouring it on our paper structure. So a lot of the ways that this infrastructure is manifest in our projects is as a kind of jolt to people to kind of an attempt to make these systems visible and to use design, but also color and graphics as a way to kind of make people think about their relationship with the environment and with natural systems differently. And so in our work, we're kind of always pushing also this idea of second nature, that there is no real wilderness or real nature left, that man's impact on the planet is so big that every nature has some kind of mediated condition through habitation and through cities. So we've done projects where this kind of landscape is used almost as a material, a kind of graphic material. This was for a park over a train, with actually no actual real ground underneath it, or to use materials like sand for a project in Miami. This was a celebration of sand where we created hills and valleys. And then in 2009, the year after we finished the farm exhibition, we were approached by Alice Waters, who was a chef in San Francisco, to design a series of permanent urban farms in public schools throughout New York City. And we've been building these since 2009. This was the first one, which was in Brooklyn. And it was an old parking lot that we tore up and put a half-acre working urban farm, and also a building that really celebrates this kind of relationship between city and nature through education. So the idea is that the children are either planting vegetables and food, or they're cooking the vegetables that they've planted and harvested. And it's all integrated with what they're studying. So they will study math, science, art, history, all through cooking and growing food. And so the building, this was a project that was started in California. When we brought it to New York, obviously the climate is very different than California. So we had to invent a whole new typology of building because the kids are in school mostly during the winter time. So the building became very important, and it has these three sections. So the greenhouse was very important so that they could continue the growing cycle into the winter. So the greenhouse is integrated with the kitchen classroom where they take what they're learning. And then this series of circles is the third section, which is the infrastructure of the project. It's all clad in rubber, so it's almost like a toy. The idea was to use the building also as a teaching moment. You'll see that the roofs all slope with the same angle, and that is to collect all the rainwater off the roof. And one of those circles is the cistern, another circle is a composting toilet, another is the HVAC system, another is the chicken area. And so here's the building, and each of those zones has its own expression. So the glass greenhouse, the kind of loud poppy flower pattern of the teaching classroom, and here's the circles at the back. So this is the kitchen classroom. These projects are always in areas with low amounts of green space and high incidences of obesity and diabetes, other kind of food related. So it's also about changing kids and their parents' attitudes towards food. So the kitchen classroom is not an industrial kitchen, it's almost a kind of domestic kitchen. And here's the greenhouse, and that's the project at night, although it looks like it's in bright sunlight. And the pattern itself is one of those times, as Amale mentioned, where we like to work and research together with, we don't have that section, but with previous architects, and that's a kind of reference to Venturi, Scott Brown, and also a kind of side reference to James Weitz. This is the second project in Harlem, where the farm is a rooftop farm on the back here, and the greenhouse is a kind of bridge connecting the school, and there we worked with a lot of different planters as well. So here's the rooftop, and that's the greenhouse. I'm looking down onto the planter garden. So that's at the kind of scale of a building, and really, at one point we were working both at the scale of building and at the scale of urbanism, really thinking through infrastructure at the very intimate scale, but also how infrastructure and these new kind of ecological systems can create new ideas about the city. And that kind of came together in a project we did in 2011 for MoMA again, called Nature City. MoMA commissioned 5 architects to rethink the American suburb after the financial crisis. And so what we came up with was what we called Nature City, and it was an attempt to create a version of the suburbs that was both more urban and dense, so more mixed, more people living closer to each other, ground floor retail, street life, but also more, we figured there's always going to be people who want to live outside the city. So it's also more open and more natural than the suburbs. So this project is 5 times as dense in terms of people per square meter, but it's also 3 times more green space than you would have in a typical American suburb. So you see these piers, so it's kind of piers of urbanism and city life combined with huge swaths of open green space. And so and the two are separated in sections, so you can have a continuous rural experience, if you will, moving throughout the landscape, or if you pop into the city, you also have a kind of continuous street life connected with bridges, almost like a kind of mega Bruges, connected with the kind of urban bridges. Yeah, exactly. It's the Bruges that Michelle was on. And so, and the other idea was that infrastructure would be used to define new ways of living and new housing typologies. So these big, and that it would also form a new way of thinking about community. So these bigger buildings are all combined with infrastructure, and each is one small piece of infrastructure that works with the other buildings to kind of create a city that's completely unplugged from the grid. So for example, looking at water, this is the water treatment center, and we worked with civil engineers and ecologists. So this is a natural form of water treatment where the kind of smellier parts are underground, so the building kind of ramps up. And then the last section is using plants to filter the water and fish. So you have these fish ponds, and that kind of created this ribbon of housing, almost a kind of canal housing around these fish ponds, which you see here. Also thinking of water, the civil engineers told us we needed water pressure, so we needed a water tower, and we thought we would combine that with a kind of live-work tower, where the water pressure is created by waterfall and not by pipes. So inside the building you have a waterfall that's also creating the water pressure and turning turbines for power. So that gives a different kind of housing. And then here, all the compost, all the vegetable waste would be brought together to collect methane, and then another building would use the methane in a power plant. And methane requires a dome, so we had this kind of dome with this housing around it. So this is the kind of compost housing, or shit mountain, it was also called. But we have this kind of terrace housing with alternating between public and private terraces, and at the top, all the excess heat from collecting the methane would be used to heat swimming pools throughout the year, which would mean you could swim all year round. And then this housing was to let animals through, and this is the bridge housing. And that, in our office we're often doing these theoretical projects or research projects that often lead to actual projects. So this is a urban plan we're currently building in China, where we took this idea of these kind of piers of urbanism. This is a project for 7 new universities on a river, where we took the proposed kind of riverside highway and moved that inside and created a kind of more softer buffer with the waterscape, with the kind of piers of urbanism. So larger questions of environment are always entering into our work, and we're going to show quickly this project in Gabon. In 2012, we won a competition for a new conference center in Gabon in Africa, where the president wanted to use this kind of conference center to wean the country from its dependence on the oil economy and to create a kind of vision of a country as a kind of gateway to Africa. And he wanted the building to use the numbers of people that would be coming here. This is for all the heads of state for the African Union. Every 2 years they would meet in this building to kind of introduce Gabon, a country not many people know about, to the world. Gabon is amazing. 90% of the people live in one city, and the rest of the country is completely open, wild rainforest. It's also a country that embraced kind of alternative modernisms, like what's it called? Like this guy, tropical modernism here, and also this guy Dolivo, who was an Italian architect, a kind of signatory to the Organicist Manifesto, and a compatriot of Paolo Solari, who spent almost his entire career in Libreville in Gabon, and he did the master plan, which was a kind of more organic version of a modernist master plan, where the topography and these kind of circles and the connection with the water and with the outdoor area was clear, and this is still the master plan of the city. And so we wanted to kind of channel this kind of alternative, this kind of happy modernism, or hippie modernism almost, into the building. So the building the conference center is in the middle. This is a country where the temperature always stays the same day and night, every day of the year. The sun rises and sets at the same time. There's no wind, there's no earthquakes. It's a very boring country, but it does rain every day like hell. So every day it rains like hell. So in the middle of the building, we're collecting all the rainwater. And then there are 3 gardens that represent 3 different types of ecology that you find in the country. That a kind of introduction to all this wild landscape that's around, and that organizes the interior. And then the water is channeled throughout the site, but also collected at the roof, and then becomes a waterfall in one of the gardens, and then reused as a grey water system for the building. So this idea about transparency between inside and outside continues to the facade, which is a series of louvers that allow the large openings to be shaded from the very harsh sun. And in between, this is a mock-up of the louvers, in between the louvers and the wall of the building is a kind of continuous promenade that allows you to visit the gardens. So you can look out over the landscape with your fellow African dictator or president, and kind of have a meeting, or look into the gardens. Here's the waterfall. And then this is some of the construction drawings. That's the waterfall inside the thing, which we even mocked up. It's very hard to know how to create the most beautiful waterfall, so we did all kinds of tests. This is a 1/3 scale mock-up. And so the building is quite simple, the big central auditorium, and then empty spaces defined by these, kind of lobby and circulation spaces defined by these big kind of objects of the gardens that appear at times and organize the interior. The roof of the auditorium kind of reflects the waves and the water of the ocean, which is quite nearby, and the water that's collecting on the roof above that. But it also hides the lighting and all the technical equipment. And then there's a series of smaller auditoriums related to all the gardens. This one, for example, has one of the gardens as its roof, or as its ceiling, I should say. And it's a kind of root building. And that's it.
So of course, when you think about all these new plans and new ideas and liquid cities and change through climate change, there's one aspect that I think we were very interested in when we started to work on 49 cities is that some of these visionary cities actually had to do with existing cities. If you think of New Babylon, Constance, it was how do you integrate the new and the old, and I think as this Triennale shows, the kind of relationship between the two is more critical than ever. After all, preservation is one of the most sustainable ways we can engage with these issues, so it's going to be quite critical to imagine how we can both keep buildings, keep history, but also adapt it and transform it in visible and invisible ways. And so we've been really interested in preservation from the kind of early buildings that we did. This was a building for Diane van Furstenberg, Belgian fashion designer in New York near the High Line. The kind of cultural center master plan in St. Petersburg for New Holland Island, and also a project that we just did for the most recent Chicago Architecture Biennale, thinking about Art Deco, or thinking about architecture as a register of transformation between the urban and the rural, and again trying to understand through architecture how change is registered. And I won't go into detail on this project, but a lot of the so this is the kind of research that we've been doing, and one of our most recent project was for this kind of small adaptation of a beautiful building in New York, a cast iron building, so kind of industrial revolution, and in transforming it into a residential building. The client wanted to add three apartments in terms of a penthouse at the top, and the building being landmarked is quite a challenge, as you know, in all cities, to build something new that would also be kind of invisible. And so looking at constraint and guidelines and thinking about density in cities and how we still bring all these ideas about outdoors and integration between nature and architecture to the smallest possible sort of building. We looked at the views onto the building, and we weren't in luck because the building across the street is very low, so you really can see any addition from very far away. But one of the things we noticed is that just by almost registering the shadow lines of the bulkheads of our building and the adjacent building, we could create a very architectural envelope, very big envelope that could house the additional units without being visible from the street at all. And these ideas of envelope, which we'll talk later about, and thinness sort of started to play in. And so this became the kind of envelope of the new addition on the building, but completely invisible from the street, a kind of topography that would also be slightly recessed so as to create outdoor space for these apartments at the top. And so while that was the main idea for the penthouse at the top, we wanted to bring this idea of topography and this sort of second nature to the single units at the bottom, and so created, taking the core of kitchen, bathroom, the kind of water core of the apartment, kitchen, bathroom. We created also this topography that would kind of create this datum that you can also inhabit to create more density, where you would have a herb garden at the kitchen and also a small greenhouse above the guest bathroom. So when people can take a shower, the actual steam of the water makes the ferns grow. So, liquid city means, thinking about water even in the smallest spaces of the unit. So this is the kind of system of the ferns. And so from the street you can't see anything. The addition is completely invisible and the building remains intact. But from the surrounding buildings it's this kind of reflective folded surface which kind of registers the skyline at night, and then you've got this little garden with a recess of the structure at the top. And using zinc as a kind of material, it's quite kind of beautiful at night. And then, the interior is quite simple, letting light through the apartment with a kind of crenellated rooftop, and it's 3 stories, so very open. And then you can see almost these kind of little houses that frame the view onto the kind of courtyard that negotiates inside and outside. And bringing water to the smallest detail, we also have turned the elevator bulkhead into a hot tub for summer fun. So liquid city can also be quite fun. It's really interesting for us to always collaborate. So in this case, the capitals were missing on the facade, and while we weren't asked by landmarks to replace them because we couldn't find historical references for them, we nevertheless thought, it'd be interesting to reinvent a Corinthian capital for the 21st century. I mean, the Corinthian capital is the kind of natural ornament, for columns, and invited artist and architect Michael Hansmeier to script a Corinthian capital by kind of taking precedents from around the neighborhood. And so we 3D printed a kind of negative and cast this 21st century Corinthian capital in GFRC, glass, fiber, reinforced concrete. And so from afar you think it's old, but actually it's completely new.
Okay, well, we've been procrastinating the ant farm project until the sun went down, but we can't wait any longer. We were both big fans of this art and architecture collaborative ant farm when we were in school, I guess. I was teaching in Berkeley, and I knew that Chip Lord lived in San Francisco, so I just emailed him out of the blue. We had included their city, convention city, in our book 49 Cities, and he wrote right back like, yes, that's great, I'll come to your review. And so we became friends and we taught together a few times. And so for the Chicago Biennale, we thought it would be fun to kind of really work together, Ant Farm and WORKac. So this is some of what they do. So they did this Cadillac Ranch where they buried cars. They did all kinds of projects, inflatables, and always building. So they're really builders. It was a group of 3. One of them is dead, unfortunately, but we worked with Curtis and with Chip, the 2 surviving members on this project. So we first wanted to kind of get ourselves in the ant farm mode in a way, and we knew we wanted to think across scales for this project. And so we thought we'll take 3 seminal ant farm projects: the house, the city, and then a kind of building scaled project, which was a boat actually, and redraw them, reimagine them, given that the ant farm archive was largely gone through this fire in 1974. And so the first one we worked on was the house. This is called the House of the Century, which looks like this. That's maybe the most tame version of it. It's basically 2 balls and 1 large thing sticking up. It's named because the husband, it was the wife's project. The husband was like, this will be the house of the century. And they were like, okay, that's what we should call it. So they had drawings of this house, but the way that it was built was completely different from drawings. They built it themselves. So this is the interior, which they kind of all made themselves on site. It's all no straight corners, ladders that go up to sleeping lofts. So what we did is we created as-built drawings of the project as they had built it, in plan and in section. This was the only sketch that existed for the Dolphin Embassy. The idea was this would be a boat where dolphins were very big in the 70s, and so the idea and the idea of intelligence in animals. There was a woman who lived with a dolphin and actually had a romantic relationship with this dolphin for a year in California in 1973.
He committed suicide.
The dolphin?
The dolphin, yeah.
Did he? Oh, poor dolphin. When she left, yeah. So they decided to do a dolphin embassy, and there are places in here where the dolphins can swim up these kind of spiral boat ramps and drive the boat. But this was the only drawing that existed. So we took that and we there was no scale or anything, so we kind of figured out the scale of the project and created plans and sections. So when they're ready to build it, they have this all ready for them. And then the last was the biggest scale was Convention City. This was the idea for the Republican and Democratic convention to create a kind of entire city kind of amusement park where people would vote through riding and rides. And it was all surrounded with a hotel. And all of these drawings were and the model was lost in the fire. So we redrew their drawings of the city. So that was how we started the project. And we thought, and Ant Farm was really they had this van, they drove around the country, and they would kind of pull out, there was an inflatable inside it, and they were really into videos, and they actually crashed the 1972 Republican convention where Nixon was nominated. And so they drove around, but it was very American, and so we thought, let's expand the Ant Farm America, this idea of this kind of connected, interconnected, anything can happen, to the entire world, and let's take on the important issues of today, the important political issues of climate change. So the idea was to kind of create a global Ant Farm version of their van that they drove around, but for larger numbers of people. And so what we came up with is called 3C City, Convention, Climate, and Cruise. So it's a cruise ship for scientists and normal people to kind of get together and discuss climate. And that it would cruise from place to place in the world, entirely powered by wind. And the idea is that not only people would get together and talk, but also plants and animals would be invited. And so the idea is a kind of continuous skin of experimental living and discussion and communicating, which kind of envelops this central space for discussion and dialogue and debate. where it kind of dips into the water where whales and dolphins could come up and voice their opinion as well. So this kind of continuous skin forms this continuous like zone of inhabitation forms the skin of the thing, and this is what it looks like from above. And the idea is that you have the kind of collective there on the left, and then in here all these different spaces with more private spaces, let's say on the left behind this big bubble, or in a big bubble like this, where you could be private with your family or with each other in kind of small spaces. And then on the right hand side, all different places for 2 people to get together, for 4 people, for groups to have yoga, to cook together and eat together, and kind of really think through what it could mean, what a future liquid city could mean. And this is how it was exhibited in Chicago. This is the model, which is now in Dublin on exhibition. You see the big wings, that was the wind power. And here the water systems. So the idea was also that it would be collecting rainwater as it went, and it would filter down and filter all the wastewater as it came down to this pond at the bottom and then circulate back up again. And so that's the project. And then this is a little video that Chip made about the process. It's just 2 minutes. Yeah, so when the Ant Farm disbanded, Chip became a video artist and a filmmaker and taught at the UC Santa Barbara until he retired. So we were just emailing. Chip and Curtis came a couple times. Those are Curtis's drawings up there, and Curtis on the right. And we were sketching together and drawing together, and making models, and then also emailing back and forth and having Skype arguments and discussions. We were building models, they were drawing. The ice one.
Huh?
Bigger than cruise ship.
Yeah, that's a cruise. That's a scale comparison with a cruise ship. I think that's it. With the liquid city in the background. Oh, this is still me. Well, we're running out of time. No, I don't know. We'll show this project because it's fun.
Last project.
So this is, we were invited to design a parking garage facade in Miami. A city that is really suffering. A city that will not exist in a few years, but due to climate change. And so, you know, our first project in Miami, parking garage, not the most exciting, although in Miami they've really taken parking garages to a new level. They said we could project 4 feet or 1.1 meters from the edge of the building with our facade if we wanted to. So it was a kind of shallow site in a shallow, for a shallow kind of project in a shallow city. And so we wanted to do the deepest possible intervention. And the idea was to, in our 4 feet, to put everything Miami needed to become a kind of very cool city. So there's an auditorium, a DJ booth, a kind of dance floor. There's we hooked up all the roof to water reclamation. There's a cistern. We put car chargers in there. There's a lending library where you can leave a book and take a book. There's a big art gallery. There's a sculpture gallery. There's a listening lounge where you can hang out. There are 2 bars. There's places for pets. There's a large children's playground, and large if you're a child. And there's a garden growing palm trees. So all of this in the 4 feet, and all circulation. So we put all the stairs for the parking garage also in our facade. And the idea was to create a kind of human ant farm. So again, an ant farm reference, but the actual ant farm where you could kind of sometimes see and sometimes hide all this activity on the facade. And so this is the model of the project with the big art gallery in the middle. And here's all the different activities that are happening in that very narrow band behind it, and all the circulation. We were not the only architect working on this parking garage. There are 5 architects, and so we only had 20% of the facade. And as you go around the corner, we were working with Jürgen Meyer, who's a German architect, and the architects were not supposed to see what the other ones were doing. It's a kind of cadaver esquisse. But we took a peek at Jürgen's and realized he was doing this kind of finger, and so we worked together with him to negotiate the corner at least. And then after that, it's all craziness. So this is the project. It just opened 3 weeks ago. It's actually still being finished, but it's the project. And there you see all the other facades around the corner. But here's ours, which performs a lot of the necessary functions. So you see the 1.1 meter strip. And inside it, all these different spaces, double height spaces. We painted it. You can't tell this, but believe me, it's pink. Yes, everything inside is pink. So here are some of the spaces with the stairs. This is the playground. The kids come down the slide and then climb up this very scary net because they're up at the top of the garage. This is the auditorium where like 100 people can innovate. And then at night, it's all perforated metal. So at night, the activities really come through to the facade. Yeah, I guess so. What else do we have? This is Beirut. House.
You can
You want to do the house?
should we do one last, or is it too
One
much?
more?
Yeah.
So obviously an interest in the 70s and ant farm and their house was quite inspirational for the first house we're designing now, which we call, not surprisingly, the greenhouse. But we spend a lot of time in Arizona. We love the desert and also the history of earth ships, which are incredible in terms of performance and energy and being integrated in the landscape, but quite ugly. And on the one hand, you have this kind of history of earthship in Arizona. On the other, you have the kind of missionary architecture, which is also quite beautiful and uses, earth to design, create bricks. And so we wanted to bring both things together. And in thinking about the house of the century in terms of its kind of shape, we decided to reinvent the earthship. And so this is the R version of the earthship, where we lift the earthship out of the ground to create shading underneath and contrast this kind of very heavy, sort of T-shaped, almost like the inverted house of the century in the back, and then the greenhouse in the front. And the whole house is self-sustaining with photovoltaics, water collection, etc., but really contrasting the kind of rooms that are, temper the climate in terms of the day and the night, and then this kind of greenhouse in the front, which helps the air circulate. And so here you see the sort of bedrooms which are carved out of the earth in the back, and the kind of very open greenhouse. So it's a very beautiful landscape, and we're in construction documents now. So here you see the underneath can become really activated to shade the parking for the car, but also to have swings, and it's kind of very compact, two-story little house here. And then the last project, a few slides, where the idea of envelope comes back in a completely different context, is for this small library we designed in Queens. So Queens is a very interesting neighborhood. In New York, it's incredibly diverse, hundreds of languages being spoken. And the Queens Library as a system is also very interesting because it really is used for immigrants to kind of, it's their first stop in terms of trying to get a job or learn English, etc. And so we were invited to replace this building and expand 15 feet, which is 5 meters into the sidewalk. And when we first got there, we realized they were growing tomatoes in the back between the houses, because it's quite a dense neighborhood, but actually it's very green as well, and so they can really kind of grow plants, etc. And so the idea became to create a loop around around the building of kind of green that would be also articulated to have to sort of create a interface between inside and outside. So all of the reading rooms, the more public rooms, are at the perimeter of the building to kind of negotiate inside and outside, while the bookshelves are in the middle. But also are kind of that loop, let's say, is articulated to resonate with the context of the neighborhood, which is quite residential. So it's sort of slightly monumental at the corner, and it's at its highest point, and then it's sort of here. It sort of comes down and goes back up for a mini-me version for the kids, where it's really at their scale in terms of viewing the outside. And the green roof is folded slightly, so you really see the green, which becomes part of the facade on the street here. And the kind of structure of the loop is a single concrete beam, which is clad in GFRC material, so it really registers and reflects the shadows of the trees around the building as well. And it's just one kind of mold that's repeated upside down to create variety and reflection in terms of the light. So here you see the entrance, which is kind of just part of the roof that's folded up. And then the concrete beam allowed us to just have two columns on either side of the kind of loop of green. So this just opened a month ago or so. A little more? I forget. A year? No. Yes, a year ago. Sorry.
September. I don't know.
Anyway, so it's in action. So if you're ever in New York, go to Queens and you can see it there. And this is the kids area. And that's it. Thank you.
Take your questions?
Yeah, maybe.
We can answer questions. I also wanted to mention that the book is for sale over there, and you can get it today at a premium. You can pay extra for it. But in exchange, I will do a drawing on request in the book. So that is something you cannot get on Amazon.
No questions.
I've never seen all our slides in monochromatic thing, so it was very interesting.
Except the pink ones.
Yes.
Now the link to the 70s is clear.
Yes.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you.